Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second night of our mission, or as we said last night, more like a retreat. As we continue to speak about mercy, I heard a definition of mercy in which it said that mercy is graciousness shown to one who is undeserving of it. Graciousness shown to one who is undeserving of it. That then made me think, well, I don't know exactly what graciousness means. I know that, if you will, perhaps you eat at someone's home, they host you, and we would think, well, the host was a gracious host. So what does graciousness mean within a faith context? It is not merely politeness or something like that, but rather graciousness is generosity, is a generous kindness, love extended to a sinner. It is a generous kindness, that is love, extended to one who is undeserving, we would say a sinful person, an imperfect person. That notion of sinner or sinful, imperfect person, that is just a result of that original sin, our fallen nature. The limitedness of our own life, of human life. Now, if we think about mercy in this way, I remember this student when I was in Jamaica. I was also chaplain at the Jesuit school. And it was their class's turn to go on to have their retreat day. And so, in typical fashion, when it came for my time to talk, as you all know, I just spent 20 minutes talking about love. And this young student in grade 7 or so, I remember he had a question after I finished doing my little input. Again, just speaking about God's love. And the student said, if everything that you said is true, that God's love for me is always given, then why should I, as I do, get up early on Sunday morning and go to church? Because none of my friends do. And so why should I deprive myself of a sleep-in in order to go to church? Because it seems that what you're saying is that if I go or I don't go, it doesn't matter. That I will still be loved by God. In one sense, that's true. That we will always be loved by God, as we were talking last night, because God is always our Father. And it's like that prayer of St. Francis Xavier, that it's not because of the rewards or the benefits, but rather it is because I have come to know that you have first loved me. And so the reason this student should get up early on Sunday morning and go to church, not sleep in like his friends, is because his going to church is entering more deeply into that loving relationship between the human person and God. And that's why we have that church law, the Sunday obligation. It's good for us because it is insufficient, it is sad if one just receives love but never seeks to love back. If we saw a movie like that, we would say that the character who never responded to love, that's a tragic character. That's a bad character. No one would want to be like that. And so this then brings up the question of justice and mercy. Because if we just look at those definitions of justice and mercy, if mercy is that graciousness shown to one who is undeserving of it, that extension, that generous extension of kindness and love to the person, well, what about justice? Because this student who asked the question, he was coming from a perspective of justice. Because his question was essentially saying, look, I make my sacrifice. And because I make my sacrifice, I should receive an exclusive benefit. There has to be something in it for me. And so that notion of justice in its most classical definition from Plato is essentially to pay what is owed. And so we owe God, because he is creator, we owe God our praise, reverence, and worship. He is our creator. And if the human person ever sins even once, which excluding the Virgin Mary, that's all of us in history, it means then by pure justice, every person excluding Mary should be condemned. Because condemnation is the payment that is owed. And because one sins in perfect justice, condemnation is what is owed to the person. But mercy and justice are not in competition, they're not in contradiction. Because God could not be both all just and be all merciful if it seemed to be that they were competing against each other or contradicted each other. So therefore, how do we understand mercy with regard to that student's question? We understand mercy as going beyond justice. It is sort of, in a sense, an extravagance. It is going beyond it. And St. John Paul II said that mercy is the perfection of justice. And so mercy and justice aren't in contradiction. They're not in competition. But rather, God's mercy, it goes beyond, it transcends justice. And now we look at a scripture story that brings this out. The story is from Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 49. And it is the story of the woman washing Jesus' feet. And so let me read you the passage. One of the Pharisees invited him to a meal. When he arrived at the Pharisee's house and took his place at table, a woman came in who had a bad name in the town. She had heard he was dining with the Pharisee and had brought with her an alabaster jar of ointment. She waited behind him at his feet, weeping, and her tears fell on his feet. She wiped them away with her hair. Then she covered his feet with kisses and anointed them with the ointment. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who this woman is that is touching him and what a bad name she has." Then Jesus took him up and said, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Speak, Master," was the reply. There was once a creditor who had 2 men in his debt. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. They were unable to pay, so he pardoned them both. Which of them will love him more? The one who was pardoned more, I suppose, answered Simon. Jesus said, "You are right." Then he turned to the woman. "Simon," he said, "you see this woman? I came into your house, and you poured no water over my feet, but she has poured out her tears over my feet and wiped them away with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she has been covering my feet with kisses ever since I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. For this reason I tell you that her sins, her many sins, must have been forgiven her, or she would not have shown such great love. It is the one who is forgiven little who shows little love." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." In this story of the woman washing his feet, in the original, our translation says she had a bad reputation. Other translations say a sinner. But in the original text, there is a greater clarity of precisely why she had a bad reputation. And in the original, this woman washing his feet is a prostitute. And so, therefore, Simon the Pharisee sees her touching him. She, because of her occupation, is unclean. She is a sinner. Therefore, in his mind, he is saying this Jesus is allowing himself to become unclean because of the one he is allowing to touch him. Now, this woman, this love that she is showing the Lord, again, what we can understand is that she received in some way, we don't know the story, outside of this encounter at Simon the Pharisee's house. But what we can glean, what we can understand, is that this woman experienced in her heart, she experienced this generous kindness. She experienced the divine love, though she was undeserving of it. And so, rather than being condemned, she received that overflowing of God's love. As a consequence, and we'll get into this towards the end and tomorrow, but that receiving of God's mercy, that it has an impact on us. It's not a get out of jail free card, but rather its impact is that it generates love within us. That mercy, in a way, is like the fuel. It may not be a perfect description or comparison, but for me it is like the fuel of faith. That experience of mercy impacts our heart. It generates, it elicits love within us. And that experience of love, again, in this life, the taste, the name we give to the taste, we call it mercy, as was said last night. And so it means then that the person who has received mercy, within their own heart, love is being generated. It is being called forth because it is being given to the person. And then that person then seeks to be merciful, loving in their own life. So one who has received mercy then becomes a merciful person. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not all the time. But this pattern, it grows within us. It goes mercy, love, etc. And so the woman who washed his feet, again, she received that generous kindness, that divine love. Even though she herself, I'm sure in her own thoughts or the thoughts of others, she was utterly undeserving of it, but God has given it to her. And so then, having received mercy, it elicits love from her. And so then, around this table, where all these people are sitting, waiting to hear Jesus speak or teach, to try and gain more information about who this person is, all very serious stuff. And this woman stands or kneels behind him, and uncontrollably she weeps. And those tears hit his feet. And with tender care, she dries the tears, but not with a towel or a face cloth. She uses her hair. And this woman, just judging her occupation, she wasn't a rich woman, but she goes and spends a great amount to buy this ointment. It's the expensive stuff. And she anoints his feet with it. And so the great mercy of God has elicited from her, as Jesus talked in the parable, great love. Now we hear the story, we hear these words, I'm sure we're all saying to ourselves, give that to me. I want this. Meaning, I want to know this powerful experience of God's mercy, God's love. But how do I experience it? How can my Christian life be marked by the reception of mercy, the growth of love, the expression of mercy to another, and then the reception of mercy back and the growth of love within me? How can I know this pattern? It's a tough question. And it's a question outside of a few words, I can't fill it all in. Because the answer to the question is, which will simply generate a follow-up question, the answer to the question is, open our hearts to him. That's how we do it. We open our hearts in trust to God. And then the follow-up question, well, how do I open my heart? Again, that's a tougher question. And I can't come up with just a few words. But all I can do is talk about my own experience, not a perfect experience for sure. But for me, in my faith, the most substantial struggle I had, and still have though to a lesser degree, but the most substantial struggle I had in my faith was the freedom to receive God's mercy. And I know before I've told the story, but in case you missed it, I'll tell it again. And the story is in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, at the beginning, in the first third of it or so, one gives a general confession. And the general confession is a confession in which one confesses every sin in their life that they can remember, from that first one when they were a child to that last one that had happened 5 hours before making the confession. All of them. And so one prepares for maybe 2 days to make this. And the first time I made the spiritual exercises as a Jesuit novice, I was so excited to do this. And so going through the exercises with my novice master, Father Pat, I knew that it was time I should be preparing. But Father Pat hadn't mentioned a thing. And so one day I built up the courage to ask him. I said, Father Pat, should I start preparing for the general confession? And Father Pat leaned back in his rocking chair and chuckled. And he said, no, John. You're not going to make a general confession. You already think badly enough about yourself. He said, what I want you to do is instead write down all the things you're grateful for in life. And so I remember leaving and feeling really disappointed that I was going to make the spiritual exercises in an incomplete way. I wouldn't do this thing that Ignatius said was really important. And so now fast forward 15 years. I'm what's called a Jesuit tertian, third probation. And in that third probation, you make the exercises a second time. And so I was in the Philippines making this my tertianship. And when it came time for the spiritual exercises, I remember explicitly thinking, finally, I'm going to make the exercises as Ignatius intended. I'll do them correctly. And so I was making my retreat with Father Roger. And again, about a third of the way through, where I should be preparing for the general confession, Father Roger hadn't mentioned anything. So I thought to myself, well, that's strange. This seems vaguely familiar. I can't quite put my finger on it, but let me ask Father Roger. So then I asked Father Roger, should I start to prepare for the general confession? Because I didn't do it as a novice, but I've now been a Jesuit for 15 years. I'm ordained, I've had my first assignment, it was successful. I'm going to get to do it correctly. And so when I asked Father Roger if I should start to prepare, Father Roger leaned back in his rocking chair and chuckled. And he said, John, you already think badly enough about yourself, so you won't make a general confession. But rather, what you'll do is on another piece of paper, I want you to write down all, this was the little difference, not that I'm grateful, what I'm grateful for, but Father Roger said, write down on a piece of paper all the graces that you have received in your life. So I said very politely, I said, okay, thank you, Father Roger, I'll do that. And I remember leaving his office. And after leaving his office, leaving the building where we were staying and going out onto the property, onto the grass, or at least on the road by the grass because it was the Philippines and I heard there were cobras there, so I stayed on the pavement. Anyway, I was so angry at Father Roger. I was so angry at everyone because I was embarrassed. Embarrassed by the fact that after 15 years, I realized I was at the exact same spot. I had studied my philosophy. I had gone to work for 2 years at Loyola High School in Montreal. I did my 5 years of theology. I did my first assignment in Jamaica. And I'm at the exact same spot. And I remember walking on the road at the retreat house, speaking to God, the one I was angriest at. And I said, God, I've given you everything, and I'm at the exact same spot. You have forgotten me, but I will beat you to the punch. You will not forget me. I will forget you. And when I said those words to myself, however it happened, the door of my heart cracked open. I don't know exactly what it was, but I think in a way it's about, for me, I was just exhausted of trying to force the issue, or exhausted about worrying that I would be good enough in the eyes of God, in the eyes of others. So in a sense, I just said, I don't care anymore. I will forget you. And I think then, after all those years, that I just allowed God to open the door. And in allowing God to open the door, I began at that moment, in an instantaneous way, just to be filled. That sadness that I had felt a long time, or that struggle, that it just began to disappear. And it would fully disappear more or less in a few more days. Because for me, that was step one. And there are lots of other little, smaller preparation steps. But I think the big thing was allowing God to kind of open up my heart. And maybe part of that is growing to know Him in our faith. And through that relationship we share with Him, finding the confidence to sort of take our hands, in which our hands are covering our hearts, just to remove our hands. To remove our hands in trust. And therefore to allow God to open up that door of our hearts. And that final culmination of it was a few days later in praying through the Passion. It was a contemplation of Jesus being taken down from the cross, as we have the station here. And when Jesus was taken down from the cross, I remember in the contemplation seeing how roughly he was treated by the Roman soldiers. And I was standing with Mother Mary and St. Mary Magdalene. And so then I said to them, you two stay here, and let me go and see if we can take the body. That is, to go and see what shape the body was in. And so when I went over to the body of the dead Christ, when I saw his face in this prayer, that in seeing the face of the dead Christ, it wasn't prettied up, but rather I could see the injuries from the crown of thorns or the flogging. I could see the dirt, the tracks of sweat. I could see the dry tracks from tears. And so I could see him in his absolute misery. And yet in my faith now, that image remains for me the most exquisite, beautiful image that a Christian could ever see or could ever be given. Because it is in that image, it is in that face in which God's mercy, that kind, generous love, is absolutely revealed. That God would give even his life. And so it was that then, in my faith, in which God had already opened that heart, in which then that mercy could freely enter without too many obstructions that I put there. And so maybe for us, that reception of mercy, it is based on the opening up of our hearts. But maybe we should think of it as not something we do, but all we have to do is simply remove our hands from our hearts, protecting it like the wall of a fortress, and allow God access. Allow him to open our hearts. That is, to open the floodgates. To allow this kind and generous love to enter fully. Just like the woman who washed his feet with her tears. And so, from mercy, lastly, as Christians, we are people of joy. But joy does not mean joining the cheerleader squad. It doesn't mean that we're simply shiny, happy people, to quote REM if you're in your 50s or your 40s. But rather, joy is a felt knowledge, interior knowledge or experience of abiding peace. Abiding peace. And that abiding peace is through or is a symptom of the knowledge or the experience of divine love within. That generous, kind love is in our hearts. We know it. We experience it. We feel it. And so then we are people of joy. It's like the boat in the storm. The apostles were scared that the boat was sinking. And he said, "Don't you know who is here among you? Be not afraid." And so we can still have peace, even within great difficulty. And so for this evening then, maybe in our own reflection, our prayer, maybe we ask God, we plead with God, that he open our hearts fully, so that we then can allow him to pour that mercy, that love in our hearts. And this is something that God so desires to do. God bless, and I'll see you for night number 3 tomorrow.